linguistics professor in the Department of English at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette, in the south of the US, where he oversees the TESOL concentration, teaching English as a second or to speakers of other languages. And his current research is written in this thing, and it's quite complicated, so either I will let him explain it to you, or I will let you read it on your own and ask him about it. But we're looking forward to hearing him talk about a comparison of Edward Hall's Triad and Jacques Ellul'sTechnique. With that, hand it over.
Thank you, Jacob, and I do want to thank the organizers for including me in this conference. I am a newcomer to Ellul studies, or a newbie, as we say in American English, and also a latecomer as well. I didn't know anything about Ellul when I was a young man. I discovered him much later in life, and I actually discovered him by reading Jet's articles. It's the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society online. So I was reading free articles, and as I was reading many different articles, I kept coming across all of these references to Ellul, who I'd never heard of before. And when I read those references, I said, he was expressing something that I had dimly felt for a long time in my life, but I had never articulated or thought through in any clear way. And of course, Ellul is a very articulate man and explains things very well. And so eventually, somewhere down the road, I said, I've got to meet this man. So I went to my library and I checked out the Technological Society, and I checked out propaganda, and then of course after that I was hooked. And so I'm very glad to be with you today. I ask your patience if I make any mistakes or misreadings of Ellul, but I'm excited to be a part of you, and I've enjoyed the conversations I've had so far with people from many different backgrounds. There is a certain irony, I think, in the conference topic for this conference, Ellul and Charbonneau on ethics in an age of ecological and technological challenge with regard to the word ethics. As Ellul repeatedly points out, the technological society renders ethical questions moot. So what are we talking about? Are we preaching to the choir, or are we addressing the entire world? Given that technicized and non-technicized peoples do not inhabit the same ethical worldview. Both can use the same words, but mean different things. So, for example, Ellul's well-known maxim, think globally, act locally, to a technicized person could mean apply technique to a local problem. Not the solution I think Ellul would have in mind. I propose to discuss this challenge through the cultural lens of the anthropologist Edward Hall and his seminal proposal that culture consists of 3 levels. Ever since Sigmund Freud developed his idea of the unconscious, there has been a growing awareness of 2 levels of culture, called by different names, but in this paper following Hall, termed formal and informal culture. In Hall's book, The Silent Language, 1959, Hall adds a 3rd level, the technical. His analysis brings a cross-cultural and anthropological perspective to Ellul's concept of technique, and the historical record suggests that all 3 levels have been present in human cultures from the very beginning. Hall and fellow anthropologist George Traeger arrived at their tripartite theory by studying how Americans used and thought of time, observing that there were 3 kinds: formal time, which controls daily life and is taken for granted; informal time, which relates to situational time and uses imprecise expressions such as a while and in a minute; and technical time, which is used by scientists and technicians. The formal level is the overt part of culture that is taught by precept and admonition. The informal level is tacit, learned by imitation of examples around us. And Hall's technical level is akin to Ellul's technological operation, his acknowledgement of the human use of tools and procedures which have been obtained in all times and places to varying degrees. Hall here recognizes something like technique as applied to abstractions such as culture and law as being something that has been around from of old. This has implications for considering technique in its modern setting. Though Ellul has emphasized technology or technique as discourse as a particularly modern phenomenon, speaking of how techniques are becoming less and less material, he also described in the theological foundation of law how law had evolved into a highly technical framework in such ancient cultures as the Roman Empire. Ellul argued, for example, when, for instance, law has become purely technical in several nations, the law which is technically most advanced will impose itself everywhere. This is what happened with Roman law. This is also what happened with French civil code, which spread to countries as dissimilar as Japan and Turkey. But in this purely technical law, any criterion of law or non-law may be adopted. Hall also suggests that these things have been a long-standing organization of culture, and it is a component of culture that is not dependent on a society being filled with material technology. Ellul does recognize the ancient roots of technique. Technical activity is the most primitive activity of man, he wrote, in the technological society. And his assertion, the law which is technically most advanced will impose itself everywhere, looks like an early description of technique, early both in human history and in his own research. This ability of the technical to impose itself raises the question of why. What is it about human nature that makes it susceptible to domination by technology? Ellul in the Technological Society begins to address this question. I quote, and here we face a mystery. What is the origin of this activity? It, technical activity, is a phenomenon which admits of no complete explanation. By patient research, one finds areas of imitation, transitions from one technical form to another, examples of penetration, but at the core there is a closed area, the phenomenon of invention. He goes on to add, it can be shown that technique is absorbed into man's psychology and depends upon that psychology and upon what has been called technical motivation. But we have no explanation of how an activity which once did not exist came to be. Now, to return to Hall, he gives numerous cross-cultural examples where one or the other level, informal, formal, and technical, predominated in some sphere of life. Technical culture is taught explicitly using logical analysis and a coherent outline. Hall named the American Armed Forces as a particularly fine example where techniques have been worked out for training large masses of recruits. The success of the training depended less on the aptitude of the student and more on how the material is organized. So Hall cited the need for trained technicians during World War II. At the time, it had been assumed that people with mechanical aptitude would make the best airplane mechanics, but it turned out that a good shoe clerk would make a better mechanic than someone who had fixed cars all his life, because the most important trait was not mechanical aptitude, but the ability to follow instructions. The best recruit turned out to be a mildly obsessional person who could read and follow instructions, and not someone who had their own ideas on how to fix machines. Hall, by the way, that sounds very much like Ellul in all the examples he gives in his many works. Hall observed that these three states of culture were fluid and would shift into one another. I quote, formal activity tends to become informal. Informal tends towards the technical, and very often the technical will take on the trappings of a new formal system. I believe these changes can be applied to Ellul's understanding of technique as the technological swallowing up of society and the substitution of a will to power and progress in place of values that promote human flourishing. The powerful success of technology has become a new formal system, and this formal system has become an informal ideology. Echoing Ellul, Hall writes, a good deal of what goes under the heading of science would more appropriately be classified as a new formal system, which is very rapidly displacing or altering our older former systems centered in folk beliefs and religion. That is, Hall provides a cultural framework for the success of technique in terms of cultural change. Human spontaneity, for example, is culturally conditioned. I don't know if you thought about that, but people are not spontaneous in the same way in every culture, like everything. And technique makes spontaneity conscious and rational and therefore control, an example of the informal culture becoming technical culture. The push for technical solutions for all problems is an example of technical culture becoming formal culture. And propaganda, which I will not develop in this talk, with its unconscious manipulation of the human personality, is an example of formal culture becoming informal culture. One of Hall's claims is that it's extremely difficult to carry out more than one element of the formal, informal, and technical triad at the same time. Though all three are present in various situations, only one will dominate at a time. Another characteristic, I think, of Ellul'sTechnique. Hall's framework provides us with tools both to understand how technique and technology, meaning discourse about technique, become a part of formal and informal culture, and also how to communicate with those whose ethics have been shaped by the technological society. Without ethical common ground, identical words and phrases don't communicate. Hall suggests if a person really wants to introduce culture change, he or she should find out what is happening on the informal level and pinpoint which informal adaptations seem to be most successful in daily operations. Bring these to the level of awareness. Even this process can only accelerate change, not actually control it in the manner desired by people of action. And this is because the out-of-awareness nature of the informal is where all changes start. Again, I think this is what Ellul was trying to do in educating people about technique and bringing to their mind the problems we face. All of this dovetails with the theme of this conference because ethics is mediated through culture. Hence, as culture becomes fixated on technique, ethics will be mediated and shaped by technique. Ellul has stated in the Theological Foundation of Law that the content of law is in fact fundamentally the same everywhere. But while ethics is universal, ethical application is implemented via cultural understandings and expressed in ways that are acceptable to the cultural perspectives of groups. And much of that framework is unconscious to people themselves because culture largely operates beneath the level of our consciousness. Using Hall and Ellul together show us how the same ethics changes when it's expressed in technicized and non-technicized worldviews. Now, give a couple of examples here. So one example of the unconscious way in which culture gives form to ethics, I want to do a little comparison of American and French culture for a moment. And so I'm American. And so American culture has long been on a path where it increasingly has grown uncomfortable with giving over negative criticism in a variety of settings. It's really a fascinating idea. When I travel overseas, and I talk to some of you today about this, and I say, talking about communication, are Americans very direct in their communication? And almost everybody says, yes, Americans are very direct when they speak to people, very open and direct. But there is one major area in American culture where Americans are very indirect, and it's giving negative feedback, negative criticism in public settings. One way Americans apply this cultural value is by wrapping negative assessments within compliments and positive comments. And thus one can hear the cultural moray in the United States say 3 nice things for every 1 negative thing you say. In educational settings, teachers are often admonished to praise a student and find something good in their work before they point out something to criticize. Okay. In contrast, there are cultures that affirm the ethical value of giving negative feedback, such as, for example, French culture, and Israeli culture is like this as well. And I was told today that Dutch culture is like this. When asked their reasons, one can often hear the idea that truth is most important and it should not pay the price for being nice. In a cross-cultural setting, Americans don't realize how their ethical perspective can be very confusing to someone from a culture that gives out compliments more sparingly and prioritizes truth-telling over sparing one's feelings. The cultural differences here channel the ethical concerns, with American culture prioritizing being nice over saying the truth, and French culture prioritizing saying the truth over being nice. In the Culture Map by Erin Meyer, she's a professor of international business communication, she tells a humorous story of a French expatriate, Sabine, a highly energetic finance director who moved from her native France to take a 2-year assignment in Chicago, that she'd been seeking for a number of years. Maya, an expert in cross-cultural business communication based in France, had prepared Sabine for her move to American culture. After 4 months in the US, Maya called up Sabine's American boss for a pre-scheduled follow-up conversation to see how the move was going. Jacques, Sabine's boss, gave a very critical evaluation. He said, "There are several critical things that I need Sabine to change about the way she is working, and I don't see her making the effort to do so. I have spoken to her a handful of times about these things, but she's not getting the message. She just continues with the same work patterns. I spoke to her last Thursday about this, but again, there's still no visible effort on her part. We had our performance review this morning, and I detailed these issues again. We'll wait and see, but if she doesn't get in gear with these things, I don't think this job is going to work out for her." Maya was very concerned, and so she later called Sabine, the French expatriate, to ask her how the job was going. Sabine replied, "Things are going great. My team is terrific. I've really been able to connect with them. I have a great relationship with my boss. I'm blossoming. For the first time in my career, I found a job that is just perfect for me. Oh, and I have to tell you, I had my first performance review this morning. I'm just delighted. It was the best review I've ever had since I started with the company. I often think that I will try to extend my stay beyond those 2 years. Things are going so well." Why was there such a misunderstanding between the American boss and the French employee? Well, upon probing deeper, Maya identified how the opposing values of American culture and French culture led to the breakdown in communication. Americans, again, tend to give positive evaluations openly and negative evaluations wrapped in copious positive comments. French culture tends to give negative feedback more directly and positive feedback implicitly. And thus it wasn't surprising that when Sabine received her performance review, she heard the positive comments and didn't hear the negative ones because she and her boss had different expectations for what each meant. Also important for our purposes is that Jacques interpreted Sabine ethically, not neutrally. Why would she not change when I had told her to do so? We are moral beings who tend to interpret others' actions ethically, not neutrally. And that's true today, even as technique is changing the ethics of our world. Hall gives another example of how culture mediates ethics that also illustrates the formal, informal, and technical aspects of culture. And it's an episode that comes from the Depression era, but it's familiar enough to be appreciated today, at least in the United States. I don't know about France. He begins by discussing the generalities of Hispanic and Anglo-American cultures with regard again to the interaction of law, government, and family. At that time, the institution of family in Hispanic culture was developed to a size and influence that far outstripped its role in Anglo culture, yet the government occupied a much smaller role than it did in Anglo culture. So if something needed to happen, families were better at handling the affair than the government. These observations reflect the role of law in each culture. Law in Latin culture was Law in Latin culture was enforced technically, but mediated through the family. Ellul's comments about the technical nature of law in the Roman Empire. Whereas in Anglo culture, law was not supposed to be applied harshly and was guided by the formal aspects of the culture. And hence, law in Anglo culture should not be stricter than the rest of the culture. And when it is, it must be changed. If an Anglo-American comes across an unjust law, he or she is more likely to violate it. Now, this is what happened. These two cultures came into serious conflict in a western town over the enforcement of the speed limit driving. The town was predominantly Spanish, and it had a motorcycle policeman who was culturally Spanish. His duties included the responsibility of enforcing the speed limit of 15 miles per hour, not only in town, but also on the outside, which included a stretch of 2 national highways. So the police officer would arrest people who went 16 miles per hour, which brought a fine of $12.75, a very large sum of money during the Depression. Why? Because the law was enforced as a technical matter. Hence, the influence of family meant that when Spanish Americans were brought before the court, they usually had a cousin or an uncle on the bench and were typically acquitted. Now, both cultures had the same outcome. Okay? Anglo culture would not give a fine to somebody who drove 16 miles per hour. Hispanic culture would not give a fine to somebody who drove 16 miles per hour. But they got there through different routes. The Anglophone culture viewed the speed limit informally, so that there was this gray area where you could go some small number of miles per hour above the speed limit and was overlooked. The Spanish culture allowed no gray area, it was technical, but they allowed family to intervene in minor matters. Among their own culture, no one paid a fine for going 16 miles per hour. Now, this discussion is an example of the biblical teaching again, that ethics is a universal component of the human heart. Though Ellul points out that the technological society renders ethical questions moot, it doesn't mean that humans have abandoned ethics, but rather have reinterpreted ethics to fit their modern worldview. So, for example, let's consider a verse like James 4:17. So, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Do people believe this today and live by this today? I believe this is a case of how ethics has become culturally transformed by technology becoming informal culture. The growth of technology has led to the belief that everything should be solved by technology. And technology is something achieved by society rather than by an individual through individual responsibility. So a long time ago, technology was a tool among the many tools in the human toolbox, and it was used to solve some problems, but not every problem. But now technology is the only tool, and it's expected to solve every problem. So if technology is our only tool, then the right thing to do is provide a technical solution. And failure to do so is a corporate and government failure, not an individual failure. This logically leads to propaganda and the compulsion that social pressure must be brought to bear to force the government and other corporate bodies to do the right thing. So James 14:7 says, "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." But the technique translation of this verse might be, society must solve every problem by technique, and it has failed if it does not do so. The person has become society, sin has become failure, the right thing has become technique. This perhaps is one of the most distinctive characteristics of modern society that is dominated by technology, how the locus of ethics has unconsciously changed from the individual person to the entire society. I think we can see this ethical understanding in the COVID-19 pandemic. I know Jacob had talked about it this morning. I was really enjoying that, which illustrates Ellul's, I think, elucidation of technique. Now, in the following comments here, I'm not taking a stand on the science of any position of the treatment or prevention of COVID-19, but simply observing it through the lens of Ellul's technique. So the pandemic begins as an example of how technology solves problems, but at the same time creates new problems. The highly developed transportation sector that moves people and goods quickly across the globe also led to the rapid spreading of a virus before it was diagnosed. Even after lockdowns and restrictions on travel were enacted around the world, new variants of COVID from places like England, Brazil, South Africa, and India still emerged in the United States and other countries. A testimony to how technology has shrunk the world for both good and bad, but even more importantly, has turned the problems of the world into every individual's problem as well. And I feel that, I think you probably feel that every day. Centuries ago, your problems were your local problems. And today, your problems are your local problems and every other problem in the world as well. COVID shows us that. Though not yet confirmed if COVID-19 was engineered through human research, this is a possibility, an escape from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. We, of course, have another example of technology creating new problems. The ethics of the pandemic was that people demanded technical solutions to the problem of COVID-19. The only individual responsibility was to conform to the mandates issued by governments and health authorities. and the glories of technology were on full display as multiple vaccines with what appear to be high efficacy were developed in record time, a real witness to the power of human technology. Technique constantly speeds up the pace of human life, and here's a success story of science inventing solutions at a record speed. The inherent goodness of technique also expressed itself as the inherent goodness of global solutions. Technique, of course, tends to the global rather than the particular, and the logic is to ignore context and treat all things uniformly. Hence, the public discourse promoted by propaganda was the one best solution, which was vaccines rather than treatment or any other approach to the disease. Insofar as vaccines were the solution to the pandemic, and the solution appeared to be working, the whole scenario justified technique and reinforced the belief that it is the one savior for the world going forward. I've been particularly fascinated by the propaganda dimension of COVID-19, and I'm speaking here primarily in the US. Though science is an inherently messy process with competing views and theories jostling to explain the world, the major media in the US had to present one explanation at a time, and dissenting views, even from reputable scientists, were not allowed to be a part of the public discourse. When changes in policy were introduced into the narrative, as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recently did with regard to the length of quarantine after someone is diagnosed with COVID, there was an outcry about confused messaging rather than an acknowledgement that science is a progressive endeavor where understanding changes and maybe progresses as research is conducted and refined. People, so conditioned by propaganda, were threatened by hearing multiple points of views, and were definitely threatened by free discourse. Once the pandemic arrived, the propaganda and the news media shifted into high gear. There was tremendous pressure applied to promote the government's policies and an overall condemnation of expressing independent judgment on the virus and responses to it. And this condemnation was ethical. Many stories were told about how a member of some family died from COVID-19, always unvaccinated, and therefore it was unethical to think differently from the official positions voiced in the media. COVID-19, I think, has been a poster child for how technology and its consequences destroy community and human well-being. Physical distancing and masks and social lockdowns have led to social isolation and a loss of spiritual renewal and presence, which we receive from face-to-face interaction. On the whole, the pandemic has been a fine example of the new ethics that stems from technique and technical culture that has become informal culture. So I want to end now with just two implications of combining Hall with Ellul. When Hall's tripartite theory is added to Ellul's developed understanding of technique, it raises at least two other issues to consider with regard to technique. First is Hall's work on technical culture, emphasizing that it has been an intrinsic part of human society from of old, and is found in all societies. Hall gives examples of many non-Western societies where important technical culture plays a very large role in their daily life. And though Ellul always emphasizes the uniqueness of modern technique, it is of a piece with technical culture from previous millennia. It's intriguing, I think, to consider the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11. Interpreters looking at Genesis 11 focus on its explanations for the origin of languages, but I think through Ellul's lens, it speaks just as much to technique. When God says, as the people there are trying to build their tower to heaven, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." It surely sounds to me like an early warning about technique and its vast power. While the modern era has seen this intensification, which Ellul reacted to so strenuously, perhaps there's insight to be gained by probing its more long-standing presence in human culture. And these considerations might begin to help us answer, why does technique even exist in the first place? I think maybe Ellul and Hall's work together suggest that technique had to come into existence. The reasoning would be as follows. Human culture contains formal, informal, and technical culture. These are all intrinsic aspects of the human heart and human community. They define what it means to be human. All these levels contain potentials which may or may not be realized by. If something can happen, it will happen. Hence, the intrinsic potential of technical culture had to become technique. It could have happened in Genesis 11, but it happened instead, according to Ellul, in the 18th and 19th centuries. Second, the long-standing existence of technical culture causes us to revisit our spiritual assessment of technique. Why did ancient cultures follow technical means when they did? What were their motivations, spiritual or otherwise? Why did the Roman Empire follow a technical application of law? Was it forced upon them by circumstances? Ellul often explains how size forces the intensification of technique. Was there some other value they were pursuing? Hall himself, who trained Americans in both business and government to work overseas, advised them to be careful about introducing changes that violated formal norms. And one way to do this was to introduce technical changes, which he saw as a way of avoiding cultural conflict. Hall actually makes a similar comment in the Technological Society. These changes could be introduced into their technical culture, which exists in all cultures, or introduced as a new system complete in itself. This happened, for example, in Latin America, where before the automobile stage was reached, air travel was introduced. As institutions in the world grow and their need for more power increases, it means incorporating more people into their domain, technical culture, into their domain, and technical culture or technique creates a kind of unity. On the basis of Hall's premise of a level of technical culture, in addition to formal and informal culture, we could say that this is a real cultural unity. That is, there's a real shared understanding of the goodness and neutrality of technology. And I really do believe, and I'm speaking now from an American context, right? We know Ellul tells us that technique is not neutral. But we live in a world where almost everybody I know views technique as neutral, views it as the bridge because we can't somehow unify ourselves through our formal and informal cultures. And though Hall is observing some of the same phenomena as Ellul did, he did not have a negative view of technical culture as Ellul had a negative view of technique. To take a slightly different example, one could view the evolution of how the Jews understood the law of Moses in Jesus' day in terms of technical culture. So echoes can be seen in Jesus' condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23. We read in verses 16 and 17, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath." In dealing with the problem of oaths, their solution was to complicate the evaluation by distinguishing between binding and non-binding oaths on the basis of what is sworn by. I think an example of technique in applying the value of precision to human personality in a way, in this case, that ultimately gutted the moral significance of what Moses had commanded. Jesus attributed this technical change to spiritual blindness and hypocrisy, not to any good motivation on the part of the ruling class and teachers of Jewish society. Ellul has emphasized that technique is produced without a plan. Fair enough, but the question still arises, what were people's motivations? What was motivating people when they increased technique? So one thing that emerges here is that technique is an effective way to evade the moral component of life, especially as it's expressed in formal culture. But it may be that people seek to evade it for slightly different reasons, and I think it's important for us in this audience to understand that. If we accept Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees and the scribes, their technicizing of the law was a way to evade obedience to God, a bad motivation. But also people seek to evade the moral component of life as it is expressed in formal culture to avoid cultural conflict, and they use technical culture, thought to be neutral, to unite people. A move Hall even suggested to Americans who were trying to cross cultural boundaries. Seeking to avoid conflict between different peoples is a good motivation. At the same time, humans are ethical beings and their ethics doesn't go away, but is rather reinterpreted so that technique itself becomes the ethical good. I would suggest that those who like Ellul, as we are in this audience, who like Ellul are concerned with technique, need to understand the full range of reasons, both good and bad, for why people esteem and justify technique. And I would also advocate thinking culturally about Thank you.